Good evening. I'm Catherine Frank. I'm the Executive Director for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UNC Asheville called OLLI. It's a program designed to provide opportunities to thrive in life's second half through programs in lifelong learning, leadership, service, and research. I want to welcome you to our fifth and final webinar in a series focused on racial disparity in our community. Today's program is titled Understanding the Racial Wealth Gap. First, some housekeeping. Today's session is a webinar format, so as a participant, you won't be able to see yourself or to speak to the group. You should be able to see and hear our panelists. If you have a question for our speakers, please click on the icon on your screen that says Q&A. Type your question and hit return to send it. We may not get to everything, but we will pass along questions and post answers when we post the video for today's lecture on our OLLI at UNC Asheville YouTube channel. Today's program has been organized by OLLI's Volunteer Inclusion Committee. The goal of this series is to raise awareness and to inspire personal engagement and advocacy to bring about a more equitable and inclusive Asheville. Many thanks to Dana Czar of OLLI's Inclusion Committee for her thoughtful work to convene today's conversation. I also want to thank OLLI Facilities and Communications Coordinator Jacqueline Lowe for her work organizing and running the webinars and organizing the publicity for this series. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. David Greenson is the volunteer coordinator for the Racial Justice Coalition. He grew up in Oakland, California, lived for many years in New York City, and has been in Asheville for 5 years. He's a longtime community organizer with an increasing focus on anti-racist education, advocacy, and organizational consulting. Robert Thomas is a 33-year-old native of Asheville. He's an experienced community leader with a knack for innovation who centers his work around advocating for those most impacted by the inequities of the criminal justice system. As a former justice-involved individual himself, he understands the negative impacts and disparities faced by people of color in the carceral system. With over 10 years of direct experience, Robert has now narrowed his focus to racial justice, decarceration, and activism around police accountability. In addition, Robert is the newly named community liaison for the Racial Justice Coalition of Asheville and a partner in a minority-owned equity consulting firm. Robert was recently named Western North Carolina's 2020 Peacemaker by WNC for Peace and Veterans for Peace, and we want to thank him for his work, in his words, for shaking trees and causing movement, always with the end goal of peace. Our moderator today is Yashika Roniel Smith, who is a writer and editor, an experienced group facilitator, and community engagement consultant who centers her work around racial equity and inclusion. She has a demonstrated history of working in the nonprofit organization management industry. Yashika has over 5 years of deeply focused experience in seeking to understand the history of racial inequities and structural racism and the disparities that are a result of those well-constructed systems. In addition, she is skilled in fundraising, management, leadership, curriculum development, and implementation. Yashika has an Associate of Arts and Sciences degree focused in criminal justice and corrections from Virginia College in Birmingham. She serves as the Inclusive Engagement and Leadership Management the Inclusive Engagement and Leadership Manager for the Office of Equity and Inclusion for the City of Asheville. She writes, "I believe that information informs understanding. Equity is the resource needed to be successful, and the two together create the potential to grow regardless of your current position." It is my pleasure now to turn things over to our panelists.
Okay, before we get into the panel discussion, we'll briefly go over a short PowerPoint that kind of gives an overview of how we got to where we're at within the disparities. Okay, the title of this is Understanding the Racial Wealth Gap. And like we said, this would be a very brief PowerPoint. You know, we could spend hours getting into the weeds of where we're at, but this will give kind of a broad understanding of where we came from and where we're at now. Okay, this is what is the racial wealth gap? This chart shows the difference between white and black wealth. The first is the difference in average wealth, and the second is the difference in median wealth. If you'll notice, the average wealth is extremely large gap between blacks and whites. Also notice that this chart is skewed because you also have within this, you know, the Jeff Bezos and all of the super wealthy added into this average. But you also must also know that the super wealthy is also added into the black average, like with LeBron James, Oprah's, you know, all of them are added into that average as well. The median will give you a better snapshot of, you know, the average wealth of where we're at person to person individually. Okay, the racial gap since the civil rights era. And this gap isn't new, and it's only increased over time. This chart shows the gap in the past 25 years. As you can see, the line representing black people has pretty much stayed on the same straight continuum and hasn't increased much, where white has moved up and also had rapid increases periodically, especially in between 2000 and 2010. And if you remember, you know, that's when the recession happened and a whole lot of economic upheaval. Racial wealth gap and home ownership. There are many different aspects of this wealth gap, and we don't have time to dig into all of them today. We're going to focus on one key aspect of wealth, and that's owning land in your own home. And I'm gonna turn it over to David.
All right, thanks, Rob. So to understand where we are today, we have to understand how we got here. So we're going to go through some history at a very surface level. We're going to start with the year 1619, which was the year that the first enslaved Africans were brought to these shores. And it's important to note that for 246 years, well over half of their history on this continent, Black people couldn't own anything, let alone land or a home. So all the way from 1619 to 1865, there's no ownership whatsoever. Now, during that time, there is a massive giveaway of land to white people with acts like the 1816 Homestead Act signed into law by Abraham Lincoln. Now, the Homestead Act essentially gave away land to anyone willing to farm it, any white person willing to farm it. And by the turn of the century, 80 million acres have been acquired by white people in the West. So going back to emancipation, there was an initial promise of reparations at emancipation in the form of land and property. This is the famous 40 acres and a mule promise. This promise refers to one made by Union General Sherman in 1865 that was to give land that had been seized by slaveholders and to give it to some freed Black families. Now, unfortunately, well, I mean, by design, really, if you're taking our larger point, that there's no accidents in any of this we're giving you. The promise was rescinded in 1866 when President Andrew Johnson vetoed the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, essentially retaking all that land that had been given to African Americans, giving it back to white people instead. I'll hand it back over to Rob.
All right, next slide. I think this is still your part.
What about the 20th century? I thought you were going to pick it up here. Slide 10.
David, I'm seeing slide deliberate disparity, a brief timeline. I don't
Yeah.
know. Okay.
All right. Okay, I can see it now. All right, let's fast forward to the 20th century. Following World War I, Black people began moving north, a process called the Great Migration. They were feeling Jim Crow and the KKK, or fleeing Jim Crow and the KKK, and hoped for more opportunity in the north. What they found were racial covenants that enforced segregation and limited where they could rent or buy a home. For years later, a few years later, as the country faced the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt passed his New Deal program. Most people don't know that the majority of these programs were not available to Black people. Sometimes that was explicit, sometimes it was implicit, but it was always deliberate. Social Security, for example, specifically excluded domestic workers and farm workers, which was work done almost exclusively by people of color. The Homeowners Refinancing Act helped 1 million people refinance their homes, but almost all Black people were excluded. This act established the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which determined which properties were worthy of loans and which weren't. Any area with Black people in it was considered a bad loan, so you couldn't get a mortgage. And if you look at this map, this pretty much explains redlining. Redlining are the areas that were marked in red, which is where the term redlining comes from. If your house or your business was in an area that was marked red, lending institutions would not loan to you for a mortgage or for things such as working capital in order for you to finance your business operation. Which pretty much had detrimental effects on the overall economy and further destroyed home ownership by people of color. Moving along our timeline, 1944 brings the GI Bill, which facilitated a college education and home ownership for returning soldiers. But almost all of that aid went to white people because most colleges would not admit Black people, and racial covenants and redlining made it almost impossible for Black people to buy homes. Then in 1956, President Eisenhower passed the Interstate Highway Act, which led to thousands of Black homes being destroyed to make way for highways. Finally, in the 60s, we had the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. Despite these important steps forward, discrimination in housing continued. Most recently, in the housing crash of 2008, it came out that high-income Blacks were almost twice as likely to end up with subprime home purchase mortgages as low-income whites. In many areas of this country, like Asheville, North Carolina, another factor that exacerbates the racial wealth gap is gentrification, which involves white people moving in to buy properties in urban areas and driving up rent and property taxes, and thereby pushing Black people out. Okay, that concludes our PowerPoint presentation, and we'll go ahead and get into the questions that will drive our conversation.
Thank you, David and Rob. I really appreciated that informative overview. I particularly appreciated the deliberate disparity timeline. I think it gave a really quick but informative measure of what happened between 1619 and presently. So I really appreciated that. So now I'd like to focus this conversation to more personal stories of the two of you. We've heard the overarching disparities that we've all so often heard about, but I'd like to shift the conversation so that we can dig a little bit into like the personal stories of you two, if we're good with that. Okay, so my first question, and it's kind of three-parted, and I'm gonna ask that you, Robert, answer all three parts first, and then we'll go to David. So what were the economic conditions like for your grandparents? And if you could elaborate a little bit about how did they make their living? What did they own? What wealth did they accumulate and were able to pass on? And the second part of that, the second and third part of that question is, what about your parents? Kind of thinking along the same lines. What were the economic conditions what were the economic conditions like for your parents? And then thinking about your own life growing up and the economic situation that you grew up in.
Yes. My grandmother was born in the early 1920s. She never had a W-2 job. Black people were not to be employed back then. So she worked menial jobs such as cleaning individuals' houses and ironing shirts for lawyers. I have fun childhood memories of going to the flea market with my grandmother, and we would spend all day there for her to sell her knickknacks and antiques and things. And she would be happy to make $25, $30 in a day. She'd be extremely happy. And, that is how she knew how to survive. My grandfather was very similar. He passed when I was about 2 years of age. As far as what I know about himself, he was a reverend, and he also engaged in bootlegging on the side because he couldn't get an official job either. My grandmother, on my father's side of the family, she worked at Mission Hospital for a while. And about 6 months before she was getting ready to retire, my grandmother told me that they had devised a plan to get rid of her so that she could not retire, and they transferred her to the cafeteria. And they knew that she couldn't read, so her job was over the dietary trays, and you have to be able to read to hand them out because they have different codes and different specials for diets. So about 30 days later, they ended up firing her for messing up the diet trays. So you have one grandmother that couldn't read, and they survived. They had their ways of survival. They were very resilient. I'll say that. My mother, her growing up, her upbringing, she told me that she could remember several occasions where, well, for a long time, they didn't even have running water in the house because they couldn't afford it. And what they would do, they would drive to Shiloh. They used to have a spring in Shiloh, and she would fill up gallon jugs of water. And my grandmother had a kerosene heater, and she would use that to heat up water for their bath water, or sometimes even cook on the kerosene heater, because they may not have money to pay for electricity, and most of the time they didn't have water. So they devised means to survive without either of those things. My grandmother was a very, very great, loving and caring woman, very much into Christianity and religious. I still have fond memories of her holding church service in her living room, and me attending those meetings, and the energy and emotion was amazing. My father and my mother went to school together. They were high school sweethearts, and they graduated. My father was going to college at AB Tech, or to be an engineer. And I want to say about like a year before he was to get his full-time degree, he got a good job with, I think the name of the plant was Switzer then, before they had shut down. And he was into die and cast making. And my mother, she was going to be a certified nurse, a registered nurse, and that's what she was going to college for. My own upbringing, till about the age of 7, I lived in Shiloh. My parents, they both had 2 jobs. And then the crack epidemic hit, which, I was gonna go into depth about how that even came into play, dealing with the Contra scandal and governmental involvement in that whole situation. But that happens. My parents get addicted to it because it's new. A lot of Black people get addicted to it, and it tore our family apart. So they end up losing the house. We end up having to move back in with my grandmother that I told you that worked at Mission for a while. And yeah, it was a different environment. You know, I grew up with drug addicts everywhere, drug dealers in my front yard. And I just have a lot of different memories of things that happened inside of that type of environment. And I was a straight A student for a while, but you know, the things around me, I could say, influenced the changes within me. So about my 9th grade year, you know, we didn't have a whole lot of extra money. You know, I'd always had raked yards and shoveled snow, and I even sold toys at the flea market. And I noticed how other individuals were making money, and I engaged in that myself, and that changed my life for about a couple decades or so. But that was my upbringing. Hopefully, we'll have time to get into some slides of the pictures of my house.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that. I wanted to raise one other question that I'm not sure if you heard or just skipped over, but I'm wondering, I did hear you say that your parents maybe lost a house, but was there any wealth that was accumulated that was passed down to you from your grandparents?
No, there was no wealth on either side of my family. My grandmother, who was my mother's mother, that was born in the early 20s, she never owned a house. She never had the finances to even afford it, nor the credit score or anything, or any of the other qualifications that it would have taken to even gain a mortgage from a lending institution. My other grandmother on my father's side, she did own her house for a while, and she had a subprime mortgage, and because of her not being able to retire, it directly affected her being able to pay the mortgage, and she ended up having to sell it before they foreclosed on it to, you know, reap any type of money off of it so that she could survive for the rest of her life. And my mother and my father, like I said, they were about, I want to say, 7 years from paying their house off. And their drug addiction completely decimated, you know, how moralistically directed they were. And they ended up losing the house. They lost their jobs, and it messed up their lives for a while. You know, I'm very thankful to say that, you know, they're completely different people in this day and age, and I love them dearly, and I completely understand what happened to them.
Thank you for the insight, Robert. I appreciate that. So David, I have the same questions for you. I'm going to repeat them because I kind of stumbled over them the first time. So for you, David, what were the economic conditions like for your grandparents? How did they make a living, and what did they own, and what wealth did they accumulate and were able to pass on? And the same question for your parents, and then how your economic situation was as you were growing up.
Yeah. So I'll focus a little bit in just on my my two grandfathers. Both my grandfathers were the children of immigrants. So they were first generation or second generation, whatever the generation is, where your parents are the ones that came here. Their people had come from Eastern Europe. They were Jewish, and you know, as Jews in this country, faced a certain amount of anti-Semitism, a certain amount of prejudice, but and had to be resilient also, but had also just tremendous opportunities. One example of that is that my grandfather on my dad's side, my grandpa Romy, wanted to be a doctor. His father had been a doctor. His father, an immigrant to this country, was able to go to medical school and be a doctor, which already, you know, shows how certain doors were possible to open, even in spite of the fact that that he was Jewish. My grandpa wanted to be a doctor, and he couldn't get into a medical school in this country, so the family sent him to Europe to go to medical school. You know, so even though there were barriers, because one of the reasons he couldn't get into medical school in the country was they had quotas about how many Jews they let in. you can see that there still was this opportunity because the family had the resources to send him abroad. And my other grandfather, his father was a blacksmith, and he grew up sort of starting one business after another, and once again was able, living in the San Fernando Valley in California. His family was one of the first Jewish families in the San Fernando Valley. There are quite a few more Jews there now, but there weren't that many then. But there was no barrier really to them starting businesses. Eventually, he started a very successful business, renting equipment and trucks, and was able to make a lot of money. And so both these families were able to pass on to my parents, a certain amount of that wealth, and really just gave them a lot of opportunity. Both my parents grew up, in pretty comfortable circumstances, with domestic workers in the home, doing the cooking and cleaning, who generally were Black people. My father also became a doctor. So 3 generations of doctors in my family. I broke the trend, but luckily my brother became a doctor, so the tradition is preserved. But my dad was a doctor, and made that kind of professional wage. And my mom, went to social work school, became a social worker, but then came into some trust fund money from the wealth that my grandfather had built up, and was really been able to live off the passive income from that, and through acquiring different real estate and so forth. She's really had a lot of opportunity and privilege, and me myself as well. So I grew up in a family, with my dad and my stepmom. They're both professionals making pretty good money. I do want to point out that that there's some addiction in my family as well that Rob referenced. For a period of time, I was around a lot of drug use as well, and I would say a big difference is nobody got arrested in my family. Statistics show that white people actually are slightly more likely to use illegal drugs than Black people, although they are far, far, far less likely to be targeted by the police. So just wanted to throw that little nugget in, that some of that was happening in my family too, but just without the same kind of consequence. So I grew up in Oakland, California, a very racially mixed city, but still a very segregated city. I grew up in a part of the city that, if we wanted to look at those red line maps, was a green area. My parents were able to buy a house there that over the course of their lives, I think went up about 500% in value over the 30 years that they owned it, which meant that when they died and my siblings and I sold that house, there was quite a bit of money that was passed on from one generation to the next. And I think this is the story that we were telling in the PowerPoint, right? Is that when you have that generational wealth, which is not there by accident, you're able to pass that on to the next generation. The next generation doesn't start life on your own 5-yard line. You start pretty far advanced down the field, because of what the previous generation was able to boost you up with. Makes a huge difference in terms of the kinds of choices you get to make. So, yeah.
Thank you, David. I appreciate you making the connection between how differently things could look with the access and resources or the lack thereof. So I appreciate you making the connection.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry, Ishik. I was just saying, and I want to quickly say that, my family, I come from a long line of liberals, who believed in racial equality, and who, my grandfather, my grandpa Sam, helped his Black domestic buy a house in the area because she wasn't able to get a loan from a bank. She wasn't able to buy a house on her own, so they were they were kind people, benevolent people. And that can exist side by side with the fact that you're accumulating wealth by virtue of your whiteness. So you can be a good person and believe in justice, but you're still getting pretty rich from the fact that you're able to be white. So.
Thank you, David. That was a perfect segue into my next question, because I think right now where we are, you and Rob both do some work with the Racial Justice Coalition. yeah, I have an equity firm. Like equity and racism and race, those aren't taboo words anymore. Like actually they're buzzwords. Everybody's talking about them. But I want to ask the question about in what ways do you see race and racism impacting your grandparents' situation and even your parents' situation and your situation growing up? And the reason I say that was a perfect segue is because I don't know that race was something that was openly talked about. I think it was always something that we knew or didn't talk about unless we were in intimate spaces or at our dining room table with our family. But I'm interested to know in what ways did race and racism impact your grandparents' situations, parents, and yours, and if that was something that was even talked about. So I'm going to start with you this time, David.
Yeah, I mean, I think my family, like I said, liberal folks, always, wanting to talk about these things. My grandma Helen, my mom's mom, was very politically active. She was a big supporter of Tom Bradley in Los Angeles, the first Black mayor of Los Angeles. So race was talked about in my family. Both my parents were very active in the civil rights movement, marching with Dr. King and the like. And I grew up really, hearing those stories, really feeling like, isn't it great that we solved that problem already? Really sort of imagining that like the civil rights era had just addressed that, and it was just sort of a matter of time before we'd have, everybody with the same opportunities. I think there was a certain naivete around, how deeply these systems were embedded. So we didn't really talk about the disparities that much, except to say that, we were fortunate. I certainly was taught, to feel, to feel some gratitude for the fact that we were, we were not struggling or poor. But there wasn't a lot of talk around the, how much that had to do with our race, with whiteness. I think it's an uncomfortable topic for a lot of white people to really lean into looking at that privilege and what that has benefited them, because for many of us, we're not sure what to do with that, what to do with the fact that we've had these advantages.
Thank you, David. I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think you're right. For a lot of us, whiteness, for all of us actually, whiteness remains invisible until it's not, right? So it's this invisible piece that none of us ever recognize until we recognize it. So thank you. So Robert, the same question for you. In what ways do you see race and racism impacting your grandparents, your parents, and your situation growing up? And kind of thinking about it in the same sense that I framed it for David. Like, I know that it wasn't something that was talked about. I know in my home, it wasn't something that we talked about openly. So I'm interested to know if that was something like what that was like with your parents and your grandparents and yourself growing up.
Well, I would have to say that racism isn't something that we necessarily talked about in my house either. I was taught to act a specific way when around white people. My grandparents, when she went around white people, I could tell that my grandmothers were a lot more submissive, and like the energy changed, and they tried to, teach me certain lessons and teach me how to act when around people of a different race. And as far as the opportunities, neither of my grandmothers really had any opportunities. My grandfather's passed before, before I even started accruing memories, really. But like racism, if my grandmother wouldn't have gotten fired and been able to retire, she would have not lost her house that I looked at now, and it is literally about, I want to say 2.5 times the value of what it was when she sold it about 15 years ago. And after she lost her job at Mission, she worked at Grove Park Inn. So she was in her 60s, and sometimes she would have to, she would ride the bus to work. She's never owned a car, never drove a car. And my grandmother on my father's side, and she would sometimes walk from Grove Park Inn to her house. And, you know, she would tell me stories about some of the different things that were happening to her working at Grove Park Inn, in laundry. And my other grandmother, like I say, she was just so positive, but I see how it all played a role in like their life. Like their life pretty much was centered around surviving. That's simply what it was. Like I can't remember any of them taking a vacation, any of them enjoying free time, except maybe on the weekends. And my grandmother would, you know, she's tired. She's been working these long hours on these jobs, and she, you know, she would just relax and watch TV. My other grandmother, like I said, she cleaned houses. I went to several different wealthy, affluent white people's house where she would be cleaning their house. Some of them stayed in Ballantree, I still remember. And like ironing lawyers' clothes. I remember lawyers coming by to pick their clothes up that she's ironed and pressed, and giving people rides, because my mother's mother, she did have a car. The only reason she had got that car because a family that she'd been cleaning their house for like 10 or 12 years had bought her a car, like, because they liked her so much. And it's like, that's what kind of life is that? I mean, she's never had any type of like official job. There was no ladder for her to climb up. You know, she had to take care of her sisters, so she ended up dropping out of school in like 8th grade to take care of her sisters, and just like her whole situation. And like that was never any wealth. Like her parents didn't pass on to her a house or anything. Neither did my grandparents pass it on to my parents, and my parents don't have such to pass on to me. And that makes things different, you know, when you have passive income or you have something that you can use as collateral or accrue equity off of. You know, that can be the difference between paying for college tuition. That can be the difference between you know, a family member helping you buy your own house. Like, you know, every generation, you know, after slavery within my family has pretty much had to start back over from scratch, because there has not been a generational wealth to pass on from one to the next.
Thank you, Robert. And again, thank you and David both for bringing such an informative like slideshow and then bringing that to your personal lives. I appreciate seeing the contrast. I appreciate both of you telling the story so personally that feeds into that overarching story. I think that I've heard you both recognize that these systems aren't by accident, right? This is all by design. So I appreciate you telling the story around that. Yeah. Before we get to our last question, I want to point out that we have, I think, one question in the chat. And so I'll pull that up and pose that to you too. And I know that you two also mentioned slides, maybe with some photos of maybe your grandmother's house, Robert.
I think we have a couple of both of us houses, just to kind of like a little bit of comparison. So
yeah, we can quickly look at this if you want, Yashika, which is you know, Rob showed this earlier, these redlining maps. This is the city I grew up in Oakland, California. And you can see all the red areas, which are closer to downtown, which is where the Black folks lived, and for the most part had to you know, rent houses, could not get mortgages. And then I lived in this big green section here towards the middle of the map. And this is the house I grew up in, you know, and you know, nestled in the woods, kind of looks a little similar to some of the houses in Asheville. But and then we can look at the map here of Asheville, which also has, you know, these red sections many of which were decimated by urban renewal. Rob, do you want to talk about where in this map was I think some of your family had some homes in some of these areas, right?
Yes, my grandmother, on my mother's side, she first where she was renting property to pay off and own was Ashland Avenue, and that was land that was pretty much taken because of urban renewal. My other grandmother's house was actually on 80 Annandale in North Asheville, which is now a gentrified area. Back when I was growing up, it was it was predominantly Black. You know, I could say it was mixed, but you know, both of my grandmothers grew up and experienced segregation, and then my parents actually, my father, you know, he's told me stories about what integration was like at the high school.
Mm.
But yeah,
This is one of the houses where you grew up, right? Which is
yeah, this is the one that I probably spent the most time in on 80 Annandale. It looks completely different now. But yeah, this is where I grew up at. You know, it'd be uh, in the summertime, definitely it'd be, you know, a few people outside all the time. Because my grandmother was was at work mostly. My uncle, my father, and my mother, they were drug addicts, and my father, you know, he worked on cars. He was very good. He was always good at anything engineering wise. So he could almost fix anything on a car, and he would work on a lot of different cars to you know, finance his drug addiction. And we did have what I needed in the house as far as food. You know, I never went to bed hungry or anything like that. But yeah, this is the outside of the house. And
yeah. I
All
wanted
right.
to,
Oh, go ahead,
sorry.
David. No, go ahead.
I want to take a minute just to go back to you know, because obviously there's a lot of contrast in the circumstances that Rob and I grew up in, and one of the things that he mentioned was that, you know, for a period of time he was a straight A student, you know, and I was too, and I think it's you know, it's worth noting that, you know, I went to a school that was, you know, my high school was 40% Black, 40% white, 20% other ethnicities. But almost all my classes were almost all white. You know, there'd be a few people of color in those classes. So I got routed more and more into a particular environment, and a lot of the, you know, Black students were you know, increasingly getting targeted and sort of moved out of these kinds of classes. You know, and I think it's just worth pointing out that these systems are there not by accident but on purpose. You know, so that there's, you know, it's winnowing the competition. It's making, you know, I didn't have to compete with a student like Rob, you know, because he'd already been shuttled in a different direction, you know. And so that's sort of that's why these things exist, is so as to give more opportunity to certain people like me, you know, and to sacrifice people who are like Rob.
Thank you, David. That makes me think about where we are today in like present time, and how we're trying to combat a lot of different disparities all at once, right? With the opportunity and achievement gap in the school, and housing crises, and all of these things that are working simultaneously, either for or against, depending on which side of the line you fall on. So I appreciate you pointing that out. It looks like we have 2 questions in the Q&A box. And so the first one may not be a question. I think it may be a statement. In the 50s, there was redlining where Jews could not live. Is that something either of you would like to speak to?
no, it's a factual statement. I think we could move to the second question.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess well, I feel like what the person's getting at, though, what I would say is that I don't mean to deny the adversity that my ancestors had to deal with. You know, I think coming to this country as Jews, they did face certain kinds of prejudice and doors being closed in their faces. And I think it's just important to put it in context, and to recognize, you know, that honestly, my grandparents and parents, you know, increasingly had the option to be white and to be treated, you know, to have all the advantages that came with that. And it became less and less important that they were Jewish in terms of what opportunities they had educationally, you know, in terms of employment. My grandfather was able to start a thriving business at a time when you could not start a business or own a business, or, you know, if you were a Black person. So yes, Jews also had to deal with a certain amount of obstacle, but I think it's important to see the difference. So
Yes.
Thank you, Dave. Oh, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the questions is, what gives you hope as you deal with racial inequity? Right now, I would say what gives me the most hope is probably how aware everyone is becoming of what is going on, and how the people that are finally becoming aware are reacting. Because white privilege works in a form and fashion that you don't even realize that you have it. So a lot of people are realizing what's going on, and like I said, their reaction is like, "Oh, this is wrong. We need to do something about this," and they're working together with everyone to create change. So that's what gives me hope. I see mindsets changing. I see more individuals open and aware to what's going on and having tough conversations with their friends and loved ones, and also doing the work. Um, the education system isn't the only system that directly relates to the wealth gap. I mean, if you ask me, they're all interconnected. I mean, even the healthcare system, you have the social determinants of health, which which shows the different issues and the morbidity rates of people of color and the disparities therein, which completely affects the wealth gap. If you've got all these medical bills and you're dying of early, at an early age, that definitely plays a role on the wealth that you can pass on from one generation to the next. Your well-being also affects the ability for you to accrue wealth while you're alive. If you're sick, you can't work as much as an individual that's more healthy. The criminal justice system as well. If an individual is 10 times more likely to be locked up at the age of 16 or the age of 18, that directly affects his life then on. There's a stigma, and there are things that are put in place when you're incarcerated that directly affect your ability to accrue wealth and mostly it's involved with opportunities, job opportunities. Then you're also affected within housing. You can't get it's hard for you to get into a housing development that has any type of property management system if you have a drug charge or even a violent crime, which affects your ability to thrive. It affects, no matter how much you've changed, no matter how much you've already paid your debt, that completely affects you. Now, if you go in and you get out, but your family already has generational wealth, they can support you and they can provide for you the things that you need. But if you go in and you get out and you have nothing, plus now you have all these barriers in front of you, that's usually leads to recidivism, and that affects generational wealth and how you can accrue wealth. It also means that you are away from your family, which also perpetuates the cycle. Which why you have so many single family households with the Black mothers, where a lot of the men are incarcerated and separated away from their families at an exponential rate. And that completely affects generational wealth and also the mindset of the individual experiencing. So you could probably point out any system, whether it's education, justice, housing, economics, from contracting. I mean, this is the contracts that more established organizations and corporations are able to get compared to Black corporations can be related to a whole lot of different things. You have implicit bias with somebody not wanting to deal with a Black corporation, and then you just have the competition. You've got a corporation that has been in business for 3 or 4 generations, and you have to compete with them, and you are upstart first generation corporation. So that completely affects the accrual of generational wealth. I can literally go into every system that you could think of and pretty much explain how they all literally affect generational wealth.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, that all of the systems and all of the different layers of disparities, they're all intertwined, as you mentioned, and I'm glad that you two continue to reiterate that. With about 10 minutes left, I think we have 2 more questions. So the third question is, how can we use reparations to address the Asheville housing wealth gap? And how do we advocate for that? David, you wanna take a stab at that one?
Well, I'll get started, but I hope Rob will come in and offer some thoughts too. I mean, I appreciate the question because I do think that any meaningful reparations has to address this. The question is how, and I think that's a tougher question to answer. The debt is so great. I think mostly that we need to go after, you know, some of these vast fortunes of money that have been built up based on this exploitation, you know, over generations, and see how we can't, you know, redistribute some of that to some of the people that were part of building these things. You know, there's a big old house here somewhere in Asheville I've heard about that's got a lot of tourists coming to it that, as far as I can tell, was built by Black people for the most part, but I don't think they're getting any of the money. You know, so I think there are opportunities, but mostly I feel like the reparations process needs to really follow the lead of the Black community in terms of determining, you know, you have to ask the people who have been harmed what's going to begin to make them whole again. So I feel like it's not really my place to say how reparations should work. It's my place to figure out how to support it, how to advocate for it, as the questioner asks. So I think stay tuned. I don't quite know what the solution is or how we're going to advocate for it, but we're going to do it. What would you add to that, Rob?
I pretty much would co-sign exactly what you just said. The solution should come from the community. Community engagement on a large scale should be initiated to figure out what the community needs. I have a lot of ideas of what I would like to see, but as I said, this shouldn't come from me or any one Black individual. This needs to come from the community, and they need to decide. And to be honest, our community there are several different Black communities: Burton Street, Shiloh, East End Valley, all the public housing sites. All of these communities, they have literally been presenting plans to the city, you know, for decades of what would assist them. A couple things get implemented, a lot of things get negated. So now it looks like, how do you advocate? Advocate by now standing behind the things that these communities are advocating that they need in their community, and just empowering their voice, and the leaders and individuals within these communities that have these plans and have been trying to get these plans implemented for decades. Advocacy simply looks like getting behind them and giving them the support they need and pushing them forward. That's as simple as that to me.
Thank you, Rob. And it looks like one other question came in, but I'm going to raise up the one that came in before that. And you may have already touched on this a little, but in addition to education, what other systems do you think continue to contribute to the wealth and opportunity gap? Yeah,
I specifically wove that into my last answer, but like all of them, like there isn't a system that does not affect the wealth gap. There just isn't one. You pick one and I could show you how and where, and then probably give you some stories.
Thank you. And so the last question, I think that it has come in, and well, actually 2 more have come in. This question is for you specifically, Rob. Why have you chosen to stay in Asheville to do your work? Asheville is fortunate to have your energy and experience.
Because I'm following my instincts of what my purpose in this moment is. I got out of prison 2.5 years ago, and I started down this journey, and I pay attention to how life speaks to me, how, you know, the Creator, how God, how it speaks to me, and I try to follow where I'm being led and what I'm being led to do. And right now, I see in my mind's eye, a lot of things that that I feel like I'm being led to change and speak to. And I think here for right now is where I'm supposed to be at. I mean, the people that are around me, the situations that are happening, the change I see being created, not only by myself, but by so many other individuals that are in the same fight as me in this community, that have been in this fight even longer than me, like an innumerable amount of people. So why do I stay here? Simply because for right now, I feel that it's where I'm supposed to be. So many of my peers have left, and they ask me the same thing all the time. I promise you.
Okay, and so thank you for that, Rob. A couple of questions have come in, and I see that we have 4 minutes, so I'm gonna give you both these last few questions, and then we'll close out with how to get started and what that looks like. So here are the last few questions. I'm just gonna throw them at you. What is the way to plug in so we can support and follow the communities you mentioned? Regarding reparations, do whites have to come you with some of the ideas so that it doesn't just take the form of Black demands? It's understandable that individuals want that leveling up should happen, but that's not realistic. How do we navigate this as individuals and a community? And then the last question is, how can we help the schools in the inner city? So I know that was a lot. That was 3 questions, and I just threw them at you because we have 3 minutes. So either one of you want to take one or all, and we will get the questions from the host and the co-host, and also we can answer those via email because we are kind of running out of time.
Yeah, I feel like if we talk a little bit about ways that people can get involved, that addresses at least some of the questions that are being asked. Rob, do you want to start? What are some ways that people can be of support to the Black community in support of these issues? What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, I'd like to restate first something that I'm sure most of you all have probably already heard, and that's learn. You know, you've got to educate yourselves upon these issues and upon the different things that are happening. And most individuals that have heard that, I've heard a lot of them say, you know, I'm tired of hearing that, you know, learn. I feel like I've learned, you know, it's a lifelong journey as far as learning. But I think you'll realize the more that you learn, you start realizing exactly what it is that you can do. You start realizing where you can make changes within systems that oppress people, because the oppression is now becoming obvious to you. You see it. And you also identify where it is that you can create change. So that's the broadest version of what you can do, right? Like it's all individual. You know, for me to tell you as a group that you all should do this, and this, I don't think I will be touching on the beauty of this. Like we all have purposes. Maybe you are a director in the HR department or something. You know, you're a gatekeeper for individuals getting jobs. You can do a whole lot of things in that role and position. Maybe you work at a job where you see Black people are being victimized with implicit bias or just straight up racism. Maybe you have the power to do something about that. You know, maybe you have an excessive amount of finances that you can invest that could change people's lives. You know, I can't tell you something that would just work for everybody. Like I think you see, the more that you learn, you will see exactly where it is that you fit in at. David also has a lot more direct actions, but that was the broad answer.
Well, I entirely agree with you, Rob, that you know, a lot of where we can have the most impact depends on where we are. You know, the church or a synagogue or a place that you know, go for worship, or the organizations that you're a part of, the places that you work, etc. I think looking around at those situations, asking questions, thinking about what would it look like to confront some of these issues in the places that you are, I think that's a great place. I would say I do think there are some things that everybody can do, which have to do with paying more attention to what's happening in our local government. Going to city council meetings virtually, watching them. There's all these different commissions where all kinds of important decisions are made, and showing up to these places and watching what's happening, especially for folks perhaps in this program who may have a little more time because they're in the second half of life. I forgot exactly how it was introduced, but that's a great thing to do, is just to get more involved locally with local politics and what's happening here. You can always sign up at the Racial Justice Coalition website for updates. You can go to rjcavl.org, sign up that you want to get involved, and we'll let you know, when things are happening, that we're looking for some advocacy. So that's a great place to start there too.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, I was just gonna say thank you to both of you. We're a minute over time, and I just wanted to express my gratitude to Catherine and Jackie. I'm sorry if I did not call you by your first name, Jackie. I'm sorry. And Dana, and both you and David, just being able to share space with you. I truly appreciate the opportunity. And you answered my last question, where can people find you? You already said that, David. So thank you all for the opportunity and sharing of space virtually.
Yeah, I want to second that. And I thought it was so powerful to see both the historic framework and the personal experiences. It really made economic disparity real in human terms. And that's, I think, a rare thing. And I really appreciate that you offered us that this evening. So I do want to thank David Greenson, Robert Thomas, and Yashika Smith for this conversation and for their ongoing work in our community to help us all understand and work effectively to address the impact of systemic racism that leads to economic inequity. And I thought this was a perfect ending to our series, where you really address the ways that all these systems work together, and helping us see that they're not by accident. And I think that's really important for us to confront. We'll post this recording on our website at our Ollie at UNC Asheville YouTube channel when we complete the closed captioning. So this is the final webinar in this year's series on racial disparity in health, criminal justice, education, and the economy. This series is another step along the path to educating ourselves to understand and address the issue of racial inequity in our community. And Rob, I love that you use the term lifelong process, because that's really an important thing for all of us to recognize. We plan not only to convene further conversations, but to work together to support action that leads to a more just, inclusive, and engaged future for Asheville. We want to thank everyone who's been a panelist for sharing their time and talent with us. And we want to thank all of our participants for their commitment to follow the lead of people in our community who, in Rob's words, shake the trees, and in Nicole Cush's words, rattle the cages, and who are willing to learn more and to do better. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good night, everybody.